The WNBA has seen multiple dynasties in its near 30-year history. The league's first dynasty saw the no longer existing Houston Comets of the late 90s usher in a new era of women's pro hoops by winning 4 straight championships. The Minnesota Lynx dynasty of the 2010s guaranteed the league would see Maya Moore and company play in the WNBA finals 6 times during the decade, winning 4 of them themselves. And the most recent dynasty belongs to the Las Vegas Aces of the 2020s, winning 3 chips during the decade so far, as A'ja Wilson continues her case to eventually be considered the WNBA's greatest player of all time. But during the mid-2000s, it was the era of the Detroit Shock, as they would claim the most WNBA titles during that time period with 3. As the second ever dynasty in the league, like the Houston Comets before them, their dynasty would also be lost to WNBA history after a series of financial hardships, name changes, and relocations. My name is Caleb, and the Detroit Shock, being the second team in WNBA history to both have a dynasty and then no longer exist shortly after, is something that's pretty insane to happen in a relatively young league. While the Shock are technically still alive in the form of the Dallas Wings, they'll never be the original Detroit franchise that gave the league its second ever dynasty. This is the second installment of my WNBA Lost Dynasty series, as today we're talking about the story of the Detroit Shock franchise, their humble beginnings, their championship years, and how it all eventually became lost. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. Being an expansion team is one thing, but being one of the league's first franchises that fits that criteria comes with a specific type of pressure that the inaugural teams in the league and the later expansion teams don't necessarily have. You're a sign that the league can work in your city, but also need to get off the ground and have some success at some point relatively soon. The Detroit Shock were founded and began play in the 1998 season alongside their expansion mate Washington Mystics, just the second season ever in WNBA history, bringing the league team total to 10. The team would be owned by Detroit native and Pistons owner Bill Davidson, and they immediately got to work, hiring Nancy Lieberman as their first ever head coach and GM. She was one of the best women's collegiate hoopers of the 1970s, and despite her being 39 at the time, she was playing in the WNBA the season before her hiring by the Shock as the league's oldest player. The Shock would also get busy with building their first ever roster, choosing the players that would get the honor of being the first women to ever wear a Detroit jersey in the WNBA. The 1998 draft saw them hold 4 picks across 4 rounds, and every player they chose had their upbringing outside the United States. While none of their 4 picks had super long WNBA careers, their 4th and final pick, Sandy Brondello, was probably the best player they drafted that season. As a 5'7" point guard, she was the MVP of the WNBL in Australia just a few years earlier, and one of the greatest players to ever come from her country. The Shock would also get a handful of veterans through the expansion draft and player allocation who were definitely older to be pro hoopers but could come in and contribute to the team right away. This included Long Beach State legend Cindy Brown, whose college career had ended over a decade before her time with the Shock, but had been playing in Europe and Japan before she came to the WNBA. Detroit would also pick up another college hoops legend, Lynette Woodard, who starred at Kansas in the late 70s and was a member of the legendary 1984 Olympic gold medal team. She played in Japan until 1993 and in Cleveland in 1997 before being drafted by the Shock in the expansion draft. A roster being made up of players in their early 20s all the way to their late 30s, and most of them being rookies, was normal in the early days of the WNBA, as the Shock would complete their opening day roster with 10 out of their 13 players gearing up to play their first ever game in the WNBA. The first Detroit Shock season opened to a respectable 16,000 fans at the Palace of Auburn Hills against the Charlotte Sting, and the start of the first season of WNBA basketball in Detroit wasn't very pretty as they get off to an 0-4 start, but it didn't deter them as they'd finally get their first win in franchise history on June 21st, 1998 in Washington over the Mystics. They were being led by their first round pick Lori Halidi, 4th round pick Sandy Brondello, and veteran Cindy Brown as they start to turn their season around after a pretty horrendous start. By the final week of the season, they were fighting for a playoff spot and could have been the first expansion team in league history to make the playoffs in their first year. But as with most expansion teams, they'd miss out on the postseason, but only by 1 game. The first year of Detroit Shock basketball ended with a record of 16-13, and there was room for improvement, but a lot of great takeaways from that season to build on. The 1999 season saw them take a step back record-wise, losing 2 less games, but they would make their first ever playoff appearance, losing a 1-game semifinal matchup against the Sting in Charlotte. It should be noted that a lot of early WNBA teams had major roster turnover from season to season, and because of this, many of the players who started their career on the Shock were not there for the following seasons. Players were retiring after only a couple seasons because they were in their late 30s like Lynette Woodard, recent draft picks like Gigi Branzova were waived, and two of the Shock's three best players from the year before in Cindy Brown and Corey Halidi were traded mid-season. In 2000, the Shock would take another step back as they lose arguably their best player in their young franchise's history in Sandy Brondello to the expansion draft as she was taken by the newly founded Indiana Fever. Ironically, she'd be traded to the Miami Soul for Stephanie White, probably the only time, maybe ever, that two future head coaches were traded for each other while they were still players. 2000 would also see the firing of the first ever Shock head coach Nancy Lieberman after the team failed to reach the playoffs for the second time in 3 years and once again regressed record-wise. As the Shock continued to get worse, like with a lot of teams, the fans stopped coming to games. Averaging around 10,000 fans during their inaugural season, the next 4 seasons saw them average just a bit under 6,000. They promote assistant coach Greg Williams to head coach, but that also only lasted a season and a half as he'd only win 10 out of his 43 games as a coach, including an 0-10 start to the 2002 season. One of the few bright spots of the early era Detroit Shock was their 2001 first-round draft pick Deanna Nolan and 2002 first-round pick Swin Cash. Nolan was a 5'10" two-guard out of Georgia, and she would end up being one of the only consistent faces for the Shock for the rest of the decade. And 2002 first-rounder Swin Cash was coming off a national championship at UConn playing for Gino Auriemma, and the future Basketball Hall of Famer was taken by the Shock with the 2nd overall pick. And that's what any expansion franchise would really need to get off the ground. A constant presence that establishes a certain basketball culture to help the franchise make a name for themselves early on. But they obviously also need a stable presence at head coach. Enter Bill Laimbeer. You already know Bill Laimbeer, the enforcer and starting center of the 1980s Detroit Pistons bad boy era, one of the most physically imposing teams in NBA history that won 2 championships in 1989 and 1990. Laimbeer was a 4-time All-Star in Detroit and spent 11 of his 13 years as a Piston, so when news broke that he'd be the new head coach of the Detroit Shock, the city was more than for. He may have been hated by almost every other NBA fan base, but Detroit would go to war for him. He was hired as an interim coach for the rest of the 2002 season, where they finished with the worst record in the league, but the franchise turnaround that he was planning was one the league had yet to see. When you have a multiple-time NBA champion as head coach, it should ideally rub off on the players, but it's really special when you can have a certain type of influence over the front office as well. The Shock ended the 2002 season with the worst record in the WNBA, and Laimbeer decided that it was time for an almost complete roster overhaul. They'd get center Ruth Riley from the Miami Soul in the WNBA dispersal draft after Miami's franchise folded, and drafted Cheryl Ford out of Louisiana Tech, adding more young talent to the roster. With returning players like Swin Cash and Deanna Nolan, the new look Shock saw their 2003 season had them go from worst in the league to arguably the best women's team in professional basketball. Detroit would have their best season in franchise history to that point so far, going 25-9, locking up the first seed in the East and the best record in the WNBA. As the wins came in, the fans came back, as they'd have their highest average attendance that season since their first season in the league 5 years earlier. Swin Cash established herself as one of the best players in the league as she led the team with 16-6-3, while she, Deanna Nolan, and rookie Cheryl Ford were all named to the 2003 All-Star team. The Shock's 2003 playoff run was their first in franchise history and saw contributions from players up and down the roster. They take care of the Cleveland Rockers in the semifinals 2-1 and swept the Connecticut Sun in the conference finals to make it to the WNBA finals for the first time ever. Basketball in Detroit was officially back as the Shock were finally starting to win. Their NBA counterpart Pistons were becoming perennial contenders themselves, but like the Pistons a year later in the NBA finals, the Shock would be underdogs to the WNBA's own purple and gold team, the LA Sparks. The Sparks were looking to three-peat as they had dominated the WNBA the previous few years, led by defending 2-time champ Lisa Leslie. She was arguably the best player in the league at the time, and it was going to be an uphill battle for the Shock despite holding home court advantage. And in the first game, that held true. Lisa Leslie put up a dominant 23-12, but the Sparks' defense was what really shined that game. They held the Shock to an insane 29% from the field, and it really wasn't looking good for Detroit heading back to the Palace. Initially in Game 2 though, the Shock held a lead as big as 19 before the Sparks would come all the way back just to take the lead with a minute remaining. The last minute and change was a back and forth affair as the Shock had to throw literally everything at Lisa Leslie to keep the ball out of her hands. A big three by Kedra Hollins-Korn and a crucial turnover from Delisha Milton just as time expired allowed the Shock to escape with a 1-point win in Game 2 to force a decisive Game 3 on their home court. Game 3 of the 2003 WNBA Finals was the largest recorded attendance in WNBA history history at the time, packing out the Palace at Auburn Hills to watch the Shock potentially pull out their first championship in franchise history, and the game delivered and then some. In another back and forth game, Ruth Riley put on one of the greatest performances in WNBA Finals history, putting up 27 points en route to the Shock's first ever WNBA title. For her performance, she was given WNBA Finals MVP just 2 years after leading Notre Dame to the national championship in college. The 2003 Detroit Shock were the first team in American sports history to post the worst record in the league the year before, just to win the championship the very next season. The Shock had made history and brought the first pro basketball championship to Detroit since 1990, but the 2004 season saw the pendulum swing in the opposite direction. Championship hangovers can be very real in many cases, and it couldn't have been more the case with the 2004 and 2005 Shock. By no means is it easy to repeat in any league or in any sport in general, and the Shock were a prime example of this. They were running it back with a lot of their championship roster, but would post back-to-back seasons of at or near 500 records, 17 in 2004 and 16 and 18 in 2005, losing in the first round of each season. While players like Swin Cash, Cheryl Ford, and Ruth Riley continue consistent play, becoming perennial all-stars, injuries, questionable trades, and non-contributing draft picks set the team back a couple of years where things were looking kind of bleak. They were in no man's land where they definitely weren't the worst team in the league, but were nowhere near the top. Coach Lambier needed another miraculous turnaround to get this team out the mud. As the WNBA's talent pool continued to get better and younger, the Shock were going to need the pieces to fall in place or they were going to be left behind. Going into the 2006 season, they had finally gotten healthy and had one of the most balanced starting fives in the league. They had experience, could get to the rim, had elite rebounders, and made a splash trade for all-star Katie Smith that July to bolster their roster and truly become contenders again. In their 9th season as a franchise, the Shock were truly back, going 23-11 throughout the 2006 campaign. The 3 All-Stars in Swin Cash, Deanna Nolan, and Katie Smith, and the 2006 Shock finished the year with the 3rd best record in the W. After rolling through the Eastern Conference bracket, beating the Fever and Sun in the semis and conference finals respectively, the Shock were back in the WNBA Finals for the 2nd time in franchise history. They faced another California team for the WNBA title, this time the defending champion Sacramento Monarchs. They were being led by legend Yolanda Griffith, but for the first time ever, the Shock were actually favored to win the championship. With the finals now expanded to a best of 5 instead of 3, we were actually treated to a handful of blowouts as each team would take a game and then absolutely get curb stomped the very next game. Detroit would have home court advantage but got blown out in game 1 by 24 and bounced back in game 2 in a double-digit win. Games 3 and 4 in Sacramento saw the 2 WNBA Goliaths trade games again as the Monarchs took game 3 with a chance for their 2nd title in 2 years. They get blown out on their home floor and have to try and close it out in Detroit. With game 5 being the only close game in the series, the Shock would pull away in the end behind Finals MVP Deanna Nolan for their 2nd championship in franchise history and 2nd chip in 4 seasons. With another Shock championship in 2007, it was time to start talking Dynasty. They'd return most of their roster and have an insane start to the next season, going 10-1 in the first month. They'd continue to dominate the W as the league's best team, going 24-10 with the #1 overall seed come playoff time. It wasn't out of the question for the Shock to dominate the postseason field that year, and they were built for another deep run. But their 07 playoff run was anything but smooth. They struggled, but prevailed in a 3-game series versus a depleted and underdog New York Liberty squad and were pushed to the brink by the Indiana Fever in the Eastern Conference Finals, but like any great team, they were able to make it through. They were going to be playing in their 2nd straight WNBA Finals and their 3rd of the decade. This time their opponent would be the Phoenix Mercury. In Diana Taurasi's first finals appearance, her, Cappie Pondexter, and the Mercury were looking for their first WNBA title. Injuries and fatigue after a long playoff run would finally catch up to Detroit as the Mercury would take down the Shock in a hard 5-5 games, denying them the chance of a dynasty, at least in that very moment, because the 2008 season would serve as not only the penultimate year of the franchise, but serves as the last great moments of WNBA basketball in Detroit, for now at least. 2008 was the last truly great year for the Detroit Shock, but they do it without arguably their best player in franchise history. Swin Cash was traded to Seattle in the offseason, but Cheryl Ford, Katie Smith, and Deanna Nolan were going to continue to carry the torch at an all-star level. Bill Lambier and his motivated team went into the year determined to get back to the mountaintop and win that rare 3rd championship and cement themselves as the league's dynasty of the 2000s decade. It was this team in particular that began to take up some of that bad boy persona that Lambier and his Pistons were so known for 20 years earlier. They'd go 22-12 throughout the regular season, but they were also involved in the very first real brawl in WNBA history against the team they beat in the finals just a few years earlier. On July 22, 2008, just 4.5 seconds before the game was over, Plannette Pearson got entangled with rookie and that season's MVP Candace Parker on a free throw, and it was all downhill from there. Hella punches were thrown, which led to 11 suspensions in total, and it retroactively became the official sequel to the original Malice in the Palace that happened just 4 years earlier. To add more salt to the wound, Cheryl Ford tore her ACL this game and would miss the rest of the season. Malice at the Palace Part 2 footnote aside, the 2008 Shock were a very good basketball team despite the injuries, suspensions, and a brief appearance from a 50-year-old Nancy Lieberman, the first ever head coach of the franchise on a 7-day contract, as the Shock would enter the 2008 playoffs with the best record in the East and a first-round rematch against the Fever. They take care of business in a best-of-3 series and a tightly contested conference finals against the Liberty to get to their third straight WNBA finals. The 2008 finals would also be a showcase of the league's two best teams, as the Shock would take on Becky Hammon and the San Antonio Silver Stars, who had the W's best record that year. The Silver Stars ended up being completely outmatched by the physical play and veteran presence of the Shock, and they'd haul in their third championship in franchise history, solidifying the mid-decade dynasty. They joined the Houston Comets as the only franchise in WNBA history with 3 or more championships, but also like the Comets past 2008, they'd be a very short-lived franchise. The Houston Comets played their last game the same year the Shock won their last championship, but little did the players, coaches, and the city know they were also in their final days as a team in Detroit. The 2009 offseason saw the death of Pistons and Shock owner Bill Davidson, and because the Shock were losing money and Detroit was getting the worst of the 2008 recession, his wife Karen began liquidating their assets and began looking for a buyer to buy the Shock. But a new owner meant that the team would probably be relocated, and if no one could be found, that would be it for pro women's hoops in Detroit. The Shock would play their final season in Detroit in 2009, and head coach Bill Lambier will resign 3 games into the season, accepting an assistant coaching position with the Minnesota Timberwolves. He was replaced by assistant coach and former Bad Boy Piston teammate Rick Mahorn, and the Shock would have a relatively mediocre year, going 18-16. They would make it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, but the Fever would finally get the best of them, ending their season and tenure in Detroit. In a year that saw them lose their coach, they only averaged around 8,000 fans per game, and the enthusiasm for the Shock was at an all-time low. After a small bidding war, the Tulsa Hoops LLC, led by Bill Cameron and David Box, would buy the team in October 2009 and announced they were moving the franchise to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Despite the low attendance in some years, the Shock made history in Detroit. They were the second dynasty in league history, had a handful of Hall of Famers wear the jersey, and continued the hard-nosed, blue-collar style of play that the Pistons had brought to the city decades earlier. Now their championships, franchise records, and current players were going to be moving across the country to a city that had never had a pro team before. They were one of a handful of teams in the WNBA's young history to relocate from their original city, and it wouldn't be long before the next iteration of the franchise would do the same thing. After arriving in Tulsa for the 2010 season, they came with a depleted roster, a new coach, and no sense of winning ways. While the team was the same in name, this was not the same team that had won 3 championships over the last decade in Detroit. By the middle of their first season in Tulsa, every last player who had played in Detroit was no longer on the roster. Katie Smith moved on to Washington, Cheryl Ford went to play in Poland, and Deanna Nolan went to play in Russia. Despite eventually acquiring talent like Skylar Diggins in the meantime, the Shock would only make the playoffs 1 time in their 6 seasons in Tulsa during the 2015 season, their last year in Oklahoma. Midway through their last season in 2015, owner Bill Cameron shocked the WNBA world as he seemingly out of nowhere announced that he would be moving the team to Dallas. This led to an internal conflict that ended up producing a lawsuit between Cameron and minority owner Stuart Price to keep the team in Tulsa, but it was to no avail. It obviously angered all the investors in the team and the fans in Tulsa, but Cameron saw way more opportunity in Dallas as the team never really found any traction in Oklahoma. The Shock would move to Dallas and become the Dallas Wings, essentially ending what we originally knew as the Detroit Shock. The Wings have been in Dallas for a decade now and have had considerably more success than the team ever had in Tulsa, and they look to establish a real foundation with Paige Beckers as they head into the future. But as of now, the Dallas Wings still technically share franchise history with the Detroit Shock, but that could be changing very soon. In 2025, it was announced that Detroit would be receiving a new WNBA team that'll begin play in 2029 at Little Caesars Arena, bringing back WNBA basketball to Detroit. While the team hasn't been named yet, there's a chance that the original Detroit Shock's history will revert to the new team in Detroit, and the Dallas Wings will then be considered an expansion franchise. I think it would only be right for Detroit's 3 championships to go back to the city where they were won and officially be established in WNBA history again. The Detroit Shock were the second dynasty in WNBA history to have their history altered in a way that you don't see in many other leagues, and with such an interesting franchise history, I hope that Detroit is able to recapture that feeling that their WNBA team brought before it was ripped away. Every league should be very protective of its history, and I think that's especially the case with the W since it's still a relatively young league. There are kids today watching Paige Bueckers play for the Wings not knowing that the team had a whole other iteration 30 years ago. And while Paige and the Wings deserve to build their own legacy in Dallas, the old legacies of the W deserve to remain in the places where they were originally built. I hope y'all enjoyed this one. A lot of research went into it, and if you want, go check out my first iteration of this series about the Houston Comets that I made about a year ago, talking about their history and how they lost their team. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.